thank you. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you, and with all of you in the midst of taking actual action. Just to let you know, I'm a historian of science and technology, and I know there's some physicians here. There's a little bit of science in this talk, but it won't be complicated. I worked at the Hiroshima Peace Institute of Hiroshima City University for 20 years and am back now living in Portland. And I am going to talk a little bit about the world that followed August 6th and August 9th and the world that we're in now. The bomb did not drop on Nagasaki on August 9th. The United States conducted a nuclear attack against the people of Nagasaki on August 9th. And the United States conducted a nuclear attack against the people of Hiroshima on August 6th. For those people, none of whom had ever heard of nuclear weapons and had an idea of a nuclear explosion, the moment of detonation was an astonishingly existential moment. Really jarring existential moment. Their lives were changed from that moment on. But I would say that that is true for all of us. All of our lives were changed at that moment, and all of us are living in a different world. A world that is removed from the world we were in before that. A world in which we have the risk of annihilation, of global annihilation, but also a world in which we have a massive entry into our ecosystem of radionuclides from nuclear technology, regardless of whether or not we have nuclear war. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what happened since 1945 in Hiroshima. Now, you've all heard the word hibakusha. Hibakusha is the Japanese word for survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of the two nuclear attacks. I'm going to be referring to some of the stuff you learned in the basics on nuclear weapons and expanding on that a little bit here today. So the hibakusha are people who thought they would die, perhaps watched people die, perhaps tried to save people's lives, perhaps watched people they loved die. My own work focuses on what is called the global hibakusha. The global hibakusha are the people who've been exposed to radiation since 1945. And this is a map showing most of the nuclear weapon test sites. Not all of them, most of them. So let's take a closer look. You'll notice that nuclear weapons were tested on every continent except South America and Antarctica, both of which have had radiological accidents, by the way. You'll also notice that two of the nuclear weapon states, the UK and France, do not have test sites inside their own borders. Nuclear weapon testing started 3 weeks before the nuclear attack on Hiroshima and resumed 11 months after the nuclear attack on Nagasaki. There have been over 2,000 nuclear weapons detonated since the Nagasaki weapon. We think 8.6 days during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons were detonating continually, and we think that nuclear weapons weren't used because we did not experience that. But there were a lot of people who did. Here are some of the test sites with some numbers filled in. You'll see that the place with the most nuclear detonations on Earth is here in our country, in Nevada, at the Nevada test site. Another site, Kazakhstan, primary site of the former Soviet Union, almost 500 weapons. There are villages less than 30 kilometers away from the test site in Kazakhstan, and people still live on land covered with fallout from both fission and hydrogen bomb weapons. When a weapon detonates, when a nuclear weapon detonates, as I'm sure you all know, we tend to say that there are three main effects: blast, heat, and radiation. And as I know most of you know, there's two forms of radiation, which we tend to call, originally we called prompt radiation and residual radiation. The difference between them is that one is in the form of waves and one is in the form of particles. Radioactive waves, I'll show you what happened in Hiroshima to give you an idea. Here's radiation effects in Hiroshima, not unlike in Nagasaki. The weapon's detonated up in the air in order to maximize the blast energy so that there's as much damage as possible from the blast. The radiation, when the weapon explodes, blast energy, heat energy, and radioactive waves all come out from the detonation. They're all forms of energy that radiate from the detonation outward and diminish. And as you got further out from ground zero, about to 3 kilometers in any direction, they dissipated to becoming less than harmful, or less than concerning. You can think of these waves like an X-ray. When this weapon detonated, these waves, the radiation from these waves lasted less than a second. There's a burst of waves. So this is like an X-ray. You can think of it like an X-ray. When an X-ray, you're preparing for an X-ray, and when the X-ray is turned on, there are now waves going through your body, passing through your body, from which we make an image. And when the X-ray is turned off, there's no radiation present. That's the way the radioactive waves were. A burst of incredibly high energy, of waves that pass through everything. Pass through bodies, pass through buildings, pass through everything and of the body as diseases develop afterwards. Oh, excuse me. So here we know exactly, thanks, we know exactly the level of radioactive waves as you get distant from ground zero, because we know how much energy there was in the burst. We know roughly how much. So this is why when you hear Hibakusha talk, the first thing they will tell you is where they were, the distance from ground zero. I was 2.7 kilometers, I was 1.8 kilometers, because this is how they can determine how much radiation, how much radioactive waves they experienced. The particles are different though. The particles stay radioactive. The particles are a bunch of different chemicals, a bunch of different isotopes, radioactive variants of various chemicals, and they stay radioactive for a long time. So they go up into the cloud, and as the cloud drifts, the particles fall out and come down. In Hiroshima, they drifted to the northwest. The area where they came down, we tend to call black rain. There was a lot of fires in Hiroshima, and rain strips particulates out of the air, so the soot from the fires tended to stain things, so it was called black rain, but it was full of radioactive particles. What we started to understand in Hiroshima was that people who were not affected by the blast, the heat, and we didn't know at the time, but by the radioactive waves, people who were outside of the burst area were coming into the city looking for relatives, were later cleaning up the city and removing bodies, and they were all beginning to develop radiation sicknesses too. So they were not exposed to the burst of waves. They were getting particles in them. So this is how those two things work. External radioactive waves. It's called external because the radioactive source is external to the body. It's like an X-ray. It passes through the body. That's what happens when the weapon bursts. And if you're not there, you can avoid that. Particles are only dangerous, really only dangerous when they get inside of your body. If there was a pile of radioactive particles on this chair right here, I would not be in a terrible amount of danger as long as I have a little distance. The radioactive energy coming from them is fairly low. But if I got one inside of my body, through swallowing, through inhalation, and it lodged in my body, then it becomes a problem. The reason it lodges in the body is the body understands these particles as chemistry. So for example, strontium-90, which I know everyone has heard of, strontium-90 is chemically very similar to calcium. So when you get strontium-90 in your body, the body says calcium, puts it in the bones or puts it in the teeth. Iodine, when the body encounters iodine, it puts it in the thyroid gland. This is why people take iodine pills if there's a radiation accident. Fill the thyroid with good iodine before the radioiodine arrives. And while that particle is there, it's just giving off this tiny amount of energy because it's one particle, but it's irradiating, it's getting this energy off to the cells right around wherever it's deposited in the body 24 hours a day. Probably for some particles, for example, strontium-90, longer than the lifespan of the person who it's inside of. So once that particle is inside of you, this is a cloud chamber, so you can see the energy coming off from some radioactive elements. Once that particle is inside of you, it's bombarding the cells around it with energy. This too, as we know, leads to radiogenic illnesses. So a lot of the harm that has been done since 1945 has been done through the ingestion of particles from nuclear testing and from nuclear accidents and from nuclear production. Here's where those particles come from. So here's a detonation from Nevada. As you can see, here's the fireball is rising up. All of this material is moving up into the sky. All of these particles are being drawn up by the fireball. They're ionized. Some of the material is from the weapon. Some of the material is from the interaction of the physics of the detonation and the material around it. But what you see is a cloud filling up with particles. That's why there's a mushroom. There's a bunch of particles that are going up into the sky. And then they come back down. Here is a picture of a mushroom cloud from Nevada about 30 minutes after the test. Here it is laden with radioactive particles and heading for Utah. To show you that this is the kind of thing that doesn't happen and is over, I'll just show you a little bit about our own country. Here is the Nevada test site. This is a fairly well-known map that shows the passage of fallout clouds from the atmospheric tests across the nation. Everywhere there's a black spot, there were at least 2 fallout clouds that passed across the country. Here's a map showing the radiological contamination as a result of it. You'll notice that there is, of course, by the test site, fairly widespread distribution of particles, but you'll also notice that there are other places where there's a fair amount of particles. These are places where it rains or snows a lot, because that strips the particles and brings them down in higher amounts. Now, just to show you the way this isn't something that happened, but is something that continues to happen, in 2021, scientists looked for cesium-137, a particular radioactive particle that is very good at traveling in an ecosystem, and searched for it in honey samples on the eastern seaboard of the United States. They were looking for cesium-137 from Nevada test site tests, because the decay rate of the particles, we can tell when the particles were made, we can tell that they're from the tests. What they found was in 122 samples of honey on the eastern seaboard of the US, 50% had cesium-137 particles from Nevada test site tests. I doubt that anybody that developed any kind of radiogenic illness from carrying around a cesium-137 particle in their body for some period of time would say, you know, I bet this was those tests 60 years ago, 3,000 miles away. Of course not. But this is the world we made, and this is the world that we live in. And just to show you a little more, you all know about the size of nuclear weapons. We tend to talk about the size of a nuclear weapon by the amount of the blast energy. How many tons of TNT it would take to create the same effect. We tend to think of the Hiroshima weapon as about 14 or 15 kilotons. That means to get the blast explosion of the Hiroshima weapon, you would need to detonate 14,000 tons of TNT at the same second to get that much blast energy. Trinity test was a little bigger. But as you all know, in the mid-50s, we and the Soviets and then other nations developed thermonuclear. We knew this worked even before we made nuclear weapons, because in the 30s, we understood that's how stars work. So all this heat and light we have here is from the fusion of the sun. Well, these weapons are quite a bit bigger, on the scale of thousands of times bigger. Oh, sorry. Oop. So you can see by scale the Hiroshima and the Trinity weapon. Here is the Bravo weapon I'll talk about in a minute. This is the largest weapon ever detonated by the United States. This is about 15 megatons. So to get an of these weapons are not just larger than nuclear weapons. They don't just create more blast, more heat, more radioactive waves, and lots more fallout. But because of the nature of the weapons, they carry that fallout much higher in the atmosphere, to the troposphere and the stratosphere, at the top of the atmosphere, from which it then distributed globally. These particles can circle the Earth for years before they fall back down to Earth. For particles like cesium-137, which will be dangerous for 300 years, those couple years don't really matter at all. It'll come down. Here, for example, this is a photograph of the Bravo test taken from an airplane about 70 miles away. But what's really concerning about how this happened is the fallout cloud. This is the Bravo fallout cloud about 17, 18 minutes after the test, starting to drift. Here's a map the US military made of the fallout cloud at 4 days. Here you have several inhabited atolls. Here you have the Daigo Fukuyomoru, the Lucky Dragon boat, which probably many people have heard of, tuna fishing boat that was engulfed in radiation. So as an example, the Daigo Fukuyomoru, here's a boat that was about 100 miles away. They had no idea there was a nuclear explosion. They did see light in the west at dawn, but about an hour, 2 hours after that, ash began to fall on this boat. Heavy ash began to fall on this boat, which was from the fallout cloud. They had no idea what this was, but it began to irritate their skin because of the beta particles. So they thought we should wash this off. They dusted it off, they washed it. It fell for hours, hours and hours and hours. So they're washing it off the boat, and decide to head back to Japan with their tuna. They get back to Japan in about 2 weeks. Takes about 2 weeks to get back. They come to port. They all go home the next day. All of them are hospitalized with radiation sickness. And 6 months later, one crew member dies. Here is someone who's 100 miles away from a hydrogen bomb explosion, and it killed him 6 months later. The US took this map and superimposed it over the eastern seaboard to get a better idea of what would happen to the US. So they imagined what would happen if this same weapon was detonated in Washington, D.C., and the fallout cloud developed exactly the same. What they determined was everyone in Washington, D.C. would be dead from the explosion, but the entire population of Baltimore, the entire population of Philadelphia, and 50% of the population of New York City would also die unless they evacuated immediately. So less than 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you now have weapons that can kill tens of millions of people, and the way that it kills them is with fallout, not with explosions. Those fallout clouds were unleashed and circled the Earth. The people who were nearby suffered more than other people, but they have distributed their fallout all around. And particles from the direct nuclear attack there in 1945. There's more radiation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from hydrogen bomb testing than from the direct attacks. Now, so we do have to abolish these weapons. We do have to keep these weapons from being used. But there has been violence just getting to this point, and we need to recognize it. So I want to talk also about our government. So here is US government historical obligations by function during the Cold War. So not spending, but obligations. So you'll notice number one over there is military spending. You'll notice number two, nuclear weapons, separate from military spending. You also have veterans thrown in there, separate from, so the military budget, as certainly a lot of people know, is broken into multiple pieces, so it doesn't look as big as it really is. I'll add that the second one there is Social Security, which is not really government spending, it's a trust fund paid into. So what you really have is just weapons, 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 weapons. Weapons are how we spell security. So we Americans don't feel particularly secure these days, do we? Most people don't feel very secure about their retirement. Most people don't feel secure about their health care. Young people don't feel secure about their education, about their prospects. But we're the richest country in the world for that whole period of time. So security, apparently we don't think security is about people feeling secure, or we think that the only thing people are insecure from is bad people, is the enemies. So we need all the money to fight them. As you know, we are now beginning the process of nuclear modernization. We are spending, it's now estimated at this point, before we've even started the bulk of the spending, nuclear modernization mostly means new delivery systems, new submarines, new airplanes, new missiles, all of this, trillions and trillions of dollars, as well as new pit production, as you know, both at Savannah River and down at Los Alamos. This, while funding is being cut at Hanford, funding is being cut at remediating any of the past contaminated sites, funding is being cut for those who were harmed by production in the past. So nuclear modernization apparently doesn't mean making sure all of our nuclear stuff has been well cared for. What it means is spending more money. All it means is spending more money. And I dare think that there's a lot of ways we could spend $2 trillion in the United States and people would feel security. People would feel increased security. I don't think, as much as I feel protected by nuclear weapons, I don't think I'm going to feel more protected after we spend $2 trillion more dollars. And so one of the things that I would say is that we really need to contextualize abolishing nuclear weapons in a larger conversation. We need to abolish nuclear weapons. We need to protect ourselves. We need to abolish the system from producing fuel for nuclear reactors, for producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. In Japan, where, of course, we're connected to today, this summer has been the hottest summer on record. Japan is sweltering under intense heat, climate change fueled intense heat. Yet Japan is looking to possibly get more involved with nuclear weapons. Japan is also looking to restart reactors and to build SMRs. And so Japan has taken the lessons of Fukushima and the lessons of the Cold War and gone in exactly the opposite direction of peace. And we are surrounded by a continual shake. Oh, there it is. Where is it? There. Whew. If we give them all the money, we'll be secure. My point is, the fight against nuclear weapons has to be embedded in the fight against militarism in general, and not just the fight, not just thinking about nuclear weapons. One of the things that has been hard about our movement from the start is that people have been focused on the single weapon system. This single weapon system is the ultimate product of a grift of removing as much public money into private hands as possible. As long as we're yelling about the weapons, we're up at the top yelling about the effect. But we need to really fight this fight systemically, and we need to stop our government from being, and we need to support people all over the world to stop our governments from looking at us as a food source, essentially as an endless source of money, and that the most efficient way to get that money out of us is to scare us about each other as much as they can and take all the money on all sides. We need to realize we're all on the same side in this fight, and those weapons are weapons that have been used against us already in order to contaminate our ecosystem and bankrupt us. So keep fighting. And I'll let my good friend Vin follow me up to carry this forward. So thank you.
So I'm grateful you're all here. Speaking after lunch is usually when everybody dozes off, wants to take a nap, so I appreciate that you guys are hanging here for that. And I just want to thank you all for being here today, for inviting us. Thank Bo. Bo is a treasure. Bo taught Hiroshima for so many years. His book is phenomenal. Please, it's must reading. And yeah, I'm so grateful that he's in our area, and you should really follow his work. He's one of one. My name is Vincent Intondi. I am the Executive Director of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility.
sorry.
Yep.
This is for the video.
Oh, I don't know. Oh, for the video, you need me to put this on?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
No worries. Good. Okay. Before I was executive director at OPSR, I was a professor for 25 years, and I taught U.S. and African American history. All of my research on this issue focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. That's what my books and articles and things like that are all about. And so, years ago, a long time ago, when I was a young student, I made my first trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I was there as a student with students from Kyoto and university and others in the area here in Hiroshima. And I'm spending weeks going to museums and meeting with atomic bomb survivors and going to different ceremonies and having this incredible bonding experience with my new Japanese friends. And the night of August 6th, they have what's known, many of you know and heard about, the lantern ceremony down by the T-Bridge by the A-bomb dome. And you wait in that line and you write your messages on your floating lantern, and then you go in the water and you put the lantern in. And for the first time for me doing that, I'm walking through with my Japanese friends, and I had 2 weeks worth of learning what my country had done. And I was filled with such rage and anger and guilt and sorrow, and it all boiled over, and I began sobbing and apologizing. And they're saying, no, you weren't there, it's not your fault. And then in the middle of this, a little woman came over and scooped me up and consoled me, and it was Koko Tenemoto Kondo, the youngest atomic bomb survivor. And she said to me, don't ever forget this moment, but now you have an obligation to go back to the US and reach people one at a time and make sure this never happens again. Come back and go, nah, that was a good trip, and that's the end of it. I couldn't turn that off. And so, as somebody that up until that point, my career was really focused on the Black freedom movement, it now became, how can I combine these two passions of mine, which is eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons, and that's how I got started. And so, what if I told you there was another time in US history in world history, in which Israel was bombing Lebanon. We were spending more money than at any point in history on nuclear weapons. We had a president who was threatening to use nuclear weapons on our adversaries. That was in the 1980s. We've been through this before to some degree. And so what did we do back then? How did we fight back then? That was the subject of my most recent book, looking back at that time. And so, in 1982, the United Nations announced they were going to have their second session, special session on disarmament. And organizers thought this was the time to do something big. But they knew they were going to have to transcend race and class and gender and sexual orientation. They were going to have to look at right and left, and they were going to have to raise money, and they were going to have to do all these things if they really wanted to do something truly revolutionary. And so, coming out of the Vietnam War, so many people were exhausted. They were fatigued. They were underground. They had to flee the country. They were in prison. They were suffering PTSD. But Reagan woke up the sleeping giant. For Reagan, arms control was appeasement. This is a man who flirted with the idea of preemptive strikes. This is somebody that falsely asserted that the United States had unilaterally disarmed. There was not a single arms control agreement that he supported. He, of course, pushed for the new MX missile program, the B-1 bomber. And if you look at his cabinet from Alexander Haig to his vice president, to Caspar Weinberger, and on, they all supported nuclear war. In fact, if you go through and you look at some of his cabinet members when they were in their confirmation hearings, they were literally saying that only 100 million people will die. That's not the entire population. we can survive. If we give every single US citizen a shovel and a door and tell them to dig a hole deep enough and put the door over them, that will be survival. We can do that. And Reagan then comes in and oversees the largest military buildup in US history, right? He ends up growing the military budget to $130 billion in 1979 to $300 billion by 1985. Mind you, we end up in the largest recession since the Great Depression during this time as well. So from 1981 to 1989, we had a total of $2.7 trillion spent on defense. Well, how are you going to pay for this? Certainly not by cutting taxes for, taxing the rich. No, he does it by cutting social programs that help the poor, that mostly help the black community. So in the early 1980s, 24% of children under 6 were now living in poverty in this country while we were spending all this money on nuclear weapons. Over 1 million children now who depended on free school lunches, that was cut, and that was their only meal. Remember, this was also when he determined that a packet of ketchup in schools was now the vegetable requirement for you. Right? 12 million people were now declared poor in this country, and in parts of Detroit, 1/3 of children were dying before their first birthday in the richest country in the world. At the same time, in the 1980s, if you remember, we had a real rise in nuclear culture. Right? There were, between 1979 and 1983, over 130 books written about nuclear war and trying to ban the bomb. You had this channel that was called MTV at the time, and for anybody who's younger in here, they actually did play music videos back then. And you couldn't get away from nuclear issues on MTV. You had groups like Phil Collins and Genesis who had a video for one of their songs with puppets with Reagan and Gorbachev, and Reagan has dementia and he wakes up in the middle of the night and hits the red button instead of the other button and blows up the world. You had songs like Russians by Sting and the Police. You had issues of nuclear power with 3 Mile Island and others happening all during this time period. So it was all over our culture. Which again, we are seeing somewhat today, right? From Oppenheimer and House of Dynamite and these films. And it's so easy to criticize these films instead of looking at them for what they are, tools, right? They're not documentaries. They're not going to be perfect. None is, right? It's easy to criticize art than to create it. But we use these. The amount of students I had when Oppenheimer came out that knew nothing of the issue, and then I was able to use that to say, here's what he got right, here's what he got wrong, here's what wasn't included. It's a tool. Just like I see with the Odyssey today and people criticizing it. Is it perfect? No, but how many students are now going to read the Odyssey, are going to read classics and read literature? And that's what you can use to now explain why the humanities shouldn't be cut in colleges anymore, right? So there's an importance in this art. And so now the movement awakens in the 1980s. And you have SANE, and you have Union for Concerned Scientists, and you have groups like Architects for Social Responsibility, and Dancers for Disarmament, and Life Insurance Industry for Nuclear Disarmament, Athletes United for Peace, on and on. And of course, my organization, PSR. And so much of this resurgence was because of women. For my organization, Sean's organization, PSR, it was Helen Caldicott, the Australian physician, who said we need to reignite PSR from being dormant. Here I am, a woman, a doctor at Harvard, and as a mother, I should be speaking about this issue, especially the thyroid cancer happening in young children. And she had the charisma, she had the aura, she had the agent, and so she was able to get on Phil Donahue and the Today Show and Good Housekeeping and just kind of barnstorm the country talking about this stuff, which was so important. And then, of course, you had Randy Forsberg. And the key to Randy Forsberg in creating the Nuclear Freeze Initiative was she realized you need to create something that you don't need a PhD in physics or international relations to understand. The nuclear issue can be very abstract. Climate change is much easier to understand. You can physically see it. You can say, I'm going to stop the Keystone Pipeline, even though that's not the be-all, end-all, but it's agency. ICBMs, no first use, forget it, the eyes gloss over. And she recognized that. And so it's not about that academic language and that academic journal article that nobody's going to read. Malcolm X was so brilliant for so many reasons, but one of the reasons that made him so special is he could go into the halls of Oxford and debate the best minds in the world, which he did. But he could also reach the boy on the block. He could reach the drug dealer or the pusher. He could go there, and he used to always say, make it plain. I don't need to use the fancy words to reach them. Tupac Shakur is probably the only other person I've seen with that ability to cross over and do that. It's such a special skill to be able to reach those folks as well. And so the Freeze initiative also provided agency to people. You could take that and get your councilman to sign it and your neighbors to sign it and your church members to sign it. It got on ballot initiatives. It was a way to now make sure that people felt they were actually doing something tangible. And it was a key to now getting us to the June 12th rally. And so in the winter of 1981, you had those like David McReynolds and David Courtwright and Cora Weiss and Mike Meyerson, all sitting around a table going, we got to do something big here. And now the hard part began. Because as many of you know of a lifetime of organizing, now you got to form the coalitions. Now you got to find the money, right? Now you got to figure out even the slogan, the name of the organization. Now you got to figure out, is there really going to be, are we going to be intersectional before the word was popular? Because you had those that said, no, this should be a singular issue, not focused on anything else. And if we were looking for one person that we can give the credit to for organizing this, it's Leslie Cagle. Leslie Cagle is a machine when it comes to organizing, still with us today in New York City. Her work is just unprecedented. And as an openly gay woman at that time, that was not easy to do. You know, the same issues that I meet with students and organizers today on that they deal with in these coalitions. We might not want to talk about it, but it's a reality. That our movement included involves racism and misogyny and patriarchy and homophobia. Those still exist today, and they existed back then. So it was important for me to go back and talk to those folks and say, how did you navigate this? So that younger folks can learn, like, this isn't new and here's how they dealt with it. And they got a young student, Kathy Engel, who's an amazing poet and professor at NYU right now. They pulled her and said, we want you to work on getting Broadway and Hollywood involved in this, the arts. Because what I hate is so much art is looked at as an appendage to a social movement when it's central. And it should always be looked at as central. Art is so important. And so whether it was organizing Keith Haring's posters or whether it was getting Meryl Streep and all of these actors and actresses, whether it was organizing the concerts that were being put on to raise the money, she organized so that the day of the rally, there were poets on every single street corner. And so you also had Cora Weiss and William Sloane Coffin working at Riverside Church. Riverside Church, so famous for Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech, April 4th, 1967, when he famously called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. You had theater groups. You had the New York City Ballet, the Rockettes, putting in their playbills things about nuclear disarmament. That's what was happening. And not only that, this is where race came in. Because so many African Americans saw the cuts that were being made to their community and connected it with the money being spent on nuclear weapons. And so the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who's in his 90s now and still with us, he forms the Black United Front, putting together civil rights leaders and ordinary folks that wanted to get involved in this. The Third World People's Coalition, those that wanted to combine this with what was happening in Lebanon, those that wanted to combine this with what was happening in El Salvador with death squads and saw these connections. And as they're planning, this almost didn't happen because there was a fracture, there was a split. Cora Weiss and some of the other folks, they called the corporate coup. They wanted to push out all the left-wing groups. They wanted to push out all the black groups. And it got nasty, as a lot of times coalition building does. But they got together and they figured it out, in which 50% of the leadership that day was African American. In terms of homophobia, there was, when I did research for this book, and spoke to gay activists who had speaking slots at the rally. And at one point, they had all these separate task force, but they had none for the LGBTQ community. And so when they wanted to have one, some folks said, we're not going to do that because we'll alienate religious folks, especially Catholics. What they didn't know is there were 2 Catholic nuns in the meeting. And they spoke up and said, we actually want an LGBTQ task force. We welcome them. That's what was happening. And so intersectionality clearly won, because that day you could see how these things, they realized how these things were connected to nuclear weapons. And then the day came. Nobody knew how big it was going to be. Nobody knew there was going to be 1 million people there. All the train services through the New England area, the tri-state area, were completely sold out. You had people that were biking, driving, walking from all over the country, people from Canada coming in. There was a sister rally out on the West Coast, out here. You had Orson Welles going out there and speaking. Yoko Ono backstage. You had the Bread and Puppet Theater Group. Again, the arts community is so visible out there. You had thousands of African American and Hispanic activists, just citizens pouring out of Bed-Stuy, marching. You had people like Rita Marley and Shaka Khan and Gil Scott-Heron and Sweet Honey and the Rock on that stage with Coretta Scott King performing and addressing what was happening. Helen Caldicott's speech is the one that always gets noticed, because that one line she had where she says, there's no communist babies, there's no capitalist baby, a baby is just a baby. And then Randy Forsberg went up there and said, it doesn't end here. We have to go home now and organize. It can't just be a one-off. Tens of millions of petitions came from Japan, and the hibakusha were central in this rally. When it was over, not a single piece of garbage was out. It was a beautiful day, and on June 14th, 2 days later, there was a massive civil disobedience where folks got arrested. But you know, afterwards, and years later, the argument was that it was a failure because the UN never passed any major pieces, or programs or documents because of this. Reagan said he didn't care. He wasn't even paying attention. When you put 1 million people in the street in a functioning democracy, it's pretty hard to ignore that. And so you even look today and you go, well, if it was clearly a failure, look at all the things that we're dealing with today. If it was successful. But years later, and I started going through papers and diaries and archives when I was writing this book, Nancy Reagan admitted that Reagan was paying attention and was scared about what was happening and knew he had to change course. His pollsters, his PR people were telling him, you can't keep this up anymore. Millions of people are against you on this. And so this, after he watches the day after 1 million people are in the streets, every president is pushed to act. Now he starts to change his tune, right? And so he meets with Gorbachev. And when he meets with Gorbachev, Gorbachev says to him, let's get rid of all of them right now. Let's do it. I'm willing to completely disarm. The only thing I'm asking is that for 10 years, this Star Wars thing you're doing, don't weaponize space. Keep the testing in the laboratory. And if you do that, I will disarm right now. And at that golden hour, Reagan walked away. There's going to be a film coming out next week called The Brink of War, in which Jeff Daniels plays Reagan, and apparently it's about when they meet at Reykjavik. From the trailer, looks pretty awful, and it looks like they're putting all the blame on Gorbachev, which would be insane, but we'll wait to see how the whole movie plays out. And so what they got kind of as a backup is the INF Treaty, which was nothing to sneeze at. The INF Treaty, when we had it, before Trump got rid of it, got rid of an entire series of nuclear weapons in Europe. That matters. That's important. That's because of people in the streets. And so it's important for us, especially with everything we're dealing with today, We wake up in the morning, we doom scroll for 5 seconds, and we feel like we just got punched in the gut 16 times before breakfast. You're reeling. You don't know what to do. You don't know. You feel helpless. We're all there. Especially my students used to say, Prof, I'm trying to keep my grades up. I got student loans. I'm sending money back home. I'm working 3 jobs. Hope the police or ICE don't kill me on the way to school. And, oh, you want me to stop nuclear war too? I get it. I get it. But understand that this is a long movement. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And that can be hard psychologically. We don't see those victories immediately, right? So it can be tough. Mentally, mental health-wise, it's tough. I always say I'm so blessed that my wife is able at 11, 12 o'clock at night to be like, hey, Vin, maybe put the nuclear war book down and we can watch something a little bit less, just so I have somebody pull me away from that, And if you want to see any proof of victory, of what we've done, just look at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Ask any Hibaksha if they would have thought that in 2017 we would have close to 100 nations sign and then ratify a legally binding treaty in the United States to eliminate nuclear weapons. And we have that. And it's not perfect, and the nuclear powers aren't part of it. But to dismiss that because of that is so condescending to the global South who are leading this fight, the African nations, the Hispanic nations that are fighting for this. And so we use that to strengthen it. We work on it. And we have the first review conference coming up late November. And not just that, it is important to remember there was a time that on this earth there was over 70,000 nuclear weapons. That number's under 12,000 today. There was a time when the United States had over 25,000 nuclear weapons. That number is under 5,000 today. Not where we need to be, but don't dismiss that as failure. If you want to look at success or wins, the fact that we are here right now. Audre Lorde, the great poet, said it best, survival is the greatest gift of love we can give one another. We're here. And, when I think about this, what we're in right now, I'm often reminded, or I think of Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Because he uses the river as a metaphor for the Black freedom movement. And I think it can also be used here. Because with a river, with a body of water, it ebbs and flows. There are times where things are calm. We're getting arms control. Things are peaceful. There's other times like now where the waves are crashing down and the tide is rising and it's choppy out there. And we feel like we're just treading water. We're just keeping our heads above water. We're not making a difference. But you got to keep moving forward. Keep your head above water. Keep swimming that right direction. Know you're not alone. If you all, these last 2 days, take part in all of this, fold paper cranes, listen to speakers, and then after this, you forget about it till next year, then I failed. Right? Awareness without action means nothing. Remembrance without resolve is just a hollow gesture. The people that fought for an 8-hour workday were naive to think they were going to achieve it. The people that fought in the civil rights movement were naive. And those that were in the streets, probably some of you, to stop the Vietnam War were naive to think they were going to stop a war. But they did. And so I implore you, be naive. Be naive to think that you are going to change the world, because in the end, you just might do it. And I will leave you with the words of Zora Neale Hurston, who said, leap up to touch the sun. You might not touch it, but at least you'll be off the ground. Thank you. any Q&A for us, we're more than welcome. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'd love to offer that up.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do a quick time check. Yeah, thank you all. Another round of applause for our amazing speakers. So we have half an hour till our official rehearsal time for action. I would love to have a Q&A if planners could give a nod of approval or something. Okay, I'm thinking 20 minutes.
Yeah, officially, thank you, U.S., but my phone wanted you both, and I wanted to invite you. There will be the first conference on victims of nuclear weapons testing. It is on September 1st. I hope you both will join us at the UN and contribute to that. It will make marvelous presenters. If you don't have a way to get there, I can certainly help you get there through nuclear HP's website. It was instrumental in getting this happen. So, thank you for that. Also, you both mentioned your books, but you haven't mentioned your titles. Would you please let us know? I was hoping you maybe bring some copies with you, but would you please let us know what the titles of those books are?
Thank you very much. My first book for my dissertation was called The Dragon's Tail, Americans Face the Atomic Age, very much about nuclear representation in American culture in the Cold War, the early Cold War. And then I did a few edited books, Filling the Hole in the Nuclear Future, Art and Popular Culture Respond to the Bomb. I believe very much that art and culture are a key part of this fight. I edited a book on images of Hiroshima and the Holocaust in Eastern European literature and art. I did a book on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the humanities, in nuclear humanities, and my most recent book is based on all of my global hibakusha work, and that's called Nuclear Bodies, the Global Hibakusha. It's published in 2022, and a lot of the stuff I was talking about, that's all there, and it extends out beyond that, including a long analysis of the colonialism behind nuclear test site selection and nuclear production site selection and other such things.
So I have two books. My first book is African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement. And my second book is Saving the World from Nuclear War, the June 12th Disarmament Rally and Beyond. And I'm just finished a chapter for another book under Cambridge University Press, and I just wrote an epilogue for another book. Those will be out in 2027. And there's a documentary that premiered on PBS and is now making the rounds. You can see it, I believe, for free now, called Bombshell, that I was an advisor on and I appear in, and it is about the cover-up of the U.S. government about radiation exposure after Hiroshima, and my kind of role in that is because the first journalist that went in and then came back and exposed what we were doing with the radiation exposure was African-American. His name was Charles Loeb. So you can also see Bombshell, and yeah.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your intelligent and comprehensive and enlightening presentations and your hard work out there in the front line. I guess my question is more pragmatic. The tests that were done in Nevada, downstream of that, has there been any tests on cancer as far as the numbers, statistics? Anything been exposed in that regard?
Thank you very much. Yes, but it's very, very difficult research to do because the kinds of diseases that happen after ingestions of particles are not so narrowly specific as the diseases that happen after exposures to lots of radioactive waves. So depending on where the particle lodges in the body, people tend to have a lot of sort of ingestion cancer, stomach cancer, throat cancer, bowel cancer, and it's almost impossible to ascribe causation.
Yeah.
So the only way you can statistically approach this is large-scale studies, demographic studies across, but the last 100 years, let's just say, have been an extremely toxic period compared to an earlier period. So it's hard to isolate it. So there's a lot of small studies are small studies about specific particles, specific illnesses, in specific places. But they can't be extended to systemic studies that apply broadly over a whole range. So a lot of that science is narrow and specific is how that science has to be, because it depends on which particle and it depends on how it's held by the body. So it's different. So for example, if there was milk that had radioiodine in it, which is how people get thyroid cancer from radiation, from fallout, is through milk. And we all drank the milk and we all internalized the radioiodine. Some of us may pass the radioiodine through us. Some of us may retain the radioiodine in our thyroids and develop illness. There's no way to say who's who. And so those kinds of studies are really useful for radioactive waves. Everybody received a similar exposure, so it's fairly easy to track that kind of health impact. But the health impact of internalized particles is messy science to do. So there's just small studies and not larger ones that can be cited. This is one of the reasons the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission didn't do research on particles, because it's not easy.
In that movie, Oppenheimer, I forget which one of you brought that up, did they get that straight? Because they show Zillard backing down after the Trinity test. But wasn't Trinity and Nagasaki really Zillard's bomb, and Little Boy was Oppenheimer's bomb?
Well, they were both. Zillard never designed a bomb. He just had an idea.
He wanted to build a hydrogen bomb originally.
That was Teller. Yeah, Teller. Szilard was never in favor of the hydrogen bomb. Szilard had the idea for the fission weapon.
Maybe I'm getting that mixed up. Okay, Teller, yeah. I mean,
Szilard had the idea for the fission weapon and how it would work, but not the specific detonation design. So both the gun design uranium bomb and the implosion design plutonium bomb are both Los Alamos products. Szilard didn't have anything to do with either of those. So the movie was wrong in that way. Szilard was working against the weapon by the time of the Trinity test.
Yeah, they portrayed that in the movie. So the movie was correct that he backed
Yeah,
down.
you just got those things reversed. It's just, you're thinking of Teller.
Teller.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
But, remember the film was based on Marty Sherwin and Kuiper's book, American Prometheus, which won the Pulitzer, and I would highly recommend reading it. I mean, it's a tomb of a book, but if it is really the best, I think, out there on
But Trinity and Nagasaki were the same type of bombs, right?
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And part of the reason, originally they were developing the gun bomb when the theory of the implosion weapon came out in Los Alamos in research, but they really had no idea whether it would work or not. So they developed both, and they tested the implosion one. The gun bomb, the George one, they knew it was going to work because it's Chicago. Yeah. And so, But for whatever it's worth, from that point on, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we never made another gun design weapon, never made another uranium-235 weapon. We only made Nagasaki Trinity weapons because they're cheaper.
They're cheaper?
They're cheaper to make. That's the design everybody.
Aren't they really complicated?
They are, but it's easier to make plutonium than to enrich uranium. And the plutonium remains stable.
Well, okay.
Yeah, thank you. You guys each hit it out of the park. Thank you very, very much. I think there's about 15,000 plutonium pits at Los Alamos. Why is it so hard to destroy plutonium pits?
Well, all you would have if you destroyed them is plutonium powder. The pits are just an industrial product. The pits are just a form of an industrial product. It can be used quickly, but even if we disassembled them, we could reassemble them. The plutonium is intact for hundreds of thousands of years. So that's available to anybody. for the next 100,000 years or more to use.
The point is that the plutonium pit is the core of a new weapon.
The plutonium pit is put into a form that's usable.
Right.
That can be done, even if that's taken apart, that can be done with the plutonium, put back into pit form anytime. So it's the creation of the plutonium that was the crime, the first crime.
So I want to understand that you guys don't think that destruction of those plutonium pits is important.
It's important, but it's a start. It's a start because we take it out of a usable form. But the plutonium needs to be understood as incredibly dangerous military substance for 100,000 years or more. And so this is what we've unleashed on the world, regardless of what we do.
Yeah, but at the Savannah plant that was going to burn that plutonium went kaput.
Well, and the other thing is we have such a surplus right now of plutonium pits. We do not need more, and so this push that the government's now going to do to create more is just more of a grift. It's just more money that we don't need, and it's going to make it a little more dangerous.
Over here, and I'll get over there.
Just want to bring up a historical point. I graduated from high school. Speak again? Okay. I graduated from high school in 1968. And in our high school library, there was a complete copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And under atomic weapons, it showed detailed analysis and drawings of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb. So if you wanted to build one in your backyard, you could do so. If you had the components. I don't think those drawings are there anymore. The other thing I wanted to say, that we can look up your names online and get a list of your writing.
Yes. Oh yeah, we're both. Yeah.
That's the easy thing.
Easy to
You
find.
don't have to write.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And the last
By the way, look up me under Bo Jacobs, not Robert.
Okay. And the last thing was that my wife and I are active in the Peace in Gaza movement, and we've been running a demonstration here in Paulsville, 1 hour a week at Friday afternoons for the last 3.5 years. Stay out there. But what we found over that time is the percentage of people who are affirmative in the look towards us versus those who are negative. The negative ones give us the finger and all that kind of stuff. Has gone from about 16 affirmatives to 1 negative to 200 affirmatives to 1 negative. And peace is a growing thing. Peace is a growing thing.
There is I wrote a recent article that you can find, it's an academic article, you can find it online, and just because you mentioned Gaza, and I researched the issue of could the statements that were made by the Israeli government and then by our own members of Congress advocating for using nuclear weapons in Gaza violate international law as incitement to genocide under the Genocide Convention. So, because I looked at what happened in Rwanda, and so does it fall under free speech or does it fall under advocating versus inciting? A lot of that is technical, but if you're interested in the connections between the threatening to use nuclear weapons in Gaza and international law and how to connect these issues, you can find that as well online.
I'll also add about those charts. I think it was Oppenheimer that said in the late 40s, there's no secret to the atomic bomb. The secret is that it works. Everybody learned that on August 6th. The rest is engineering. So anybody can make an atomic bomb. I mean, the design's not difficult.
In your information crusade, talking to other people about the whole subject, are there any arguments that are particularly effective in changing most people's minds? There's the argument from insanity that we should just not be doing it. And there's an argument from morality. We cannot possibly do this to even one person, much less millions.
So, in my experience, there's not one message for people. It's all different. So, for example, if I'm talking to someone, a student who is an athlete, I'm going to talk to them about the history of socially conscious athletes, from Muhammad Ali, to John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the '68 Olympics, to Serena Williams, to Kaepernick, on and on. What many of them don't know is this group, Athletes United for Peace, which were professional athletes in the United States and Russian athletes and how they worked for nuclear disarmament. When I explain all the NFL players and all the NBA players, Olympic athletes that were working on this, they see a connection there. People, this is why I focus a lot too on race, is that for younger folks, when you're reading history or trying to get involved in a cause, you try to find somebody that looks like you and identifies with you, shares a common ancestry with you. And if all younger people of color see is just white people, why would they get involved in this? But when they learn that everybody from Charlie Parker to Duke Ellington to Malcolm to Martin to Coretta and Huey Newton and on cared about this issue, they see themselves in it. So that might be the message. For others, I might work on a faith message, meeting at churches and things like that. For musicians, for young kids, I might mention hip-hop artists like MF Doom and others that incorporate the nuclear issue in their music today, and that will get through to them. For others, it will be the moral issue. I remember when the first book came out, I was doing a talk in Baltimore, and a lot of the parents, I could tell, weren't engaged, except when they realized we're spending $1 trillion on nuclear weapons, and at the same time they were asking in the public schools for parents to bring space heaters in because they didn't have heat for the kids. But now they connected, right? So for some it's morals, for some it's the money issue, for it's always going to be, there's not going to be one thing that you can reach them, but there are different ways. And even now when I meet with senators and House reps, they will tell me, the staff, before I even meet with them, don't bring up the moral stuff, they don't care about it. What they care about is how much money it's going to cost. What they care about is how long it's going to take. And so that's the message you got to work on with them. I remember giving a talk once in Syracuse, New York, and everybody in the crowd said, we agree with you, but the main employer in this town is Lockheed Martin, that's where we work. And we don't even care about nuclear, it's a job. Find me another job, I'll happily do it. And so now you have to change and talk to them about that. So there's always going to be, I think, a different way to reach folks. You just have to look and say, what's going to be my in? What's going to be my unique way of kind of reaching them in this regard? Because unfortunately, you can't just bring everybody to Hiroshima or put everybody in the classroom or whatever. And I think lastly, I'll say is one of the biggest problems we have with reaching folks is the work I do at the United Nations with disarmament education is, for 20 years, I had 18 and 19-year-old kids come into my classroom knowing nothing about this issue. Nothing. So I'm starting from scratch. We have figured out how to tackle really tough issues for a younger age. The Holocaust, the slave trade, we have figured out how to make books and things that tackle that. We haven't done that with this. I'm so pleased to see that comic book out there. We need more of that. And so how do we get at a younger age for kids to learn about this before they get to college? I had a neighbor, and the kid was probably 14. And he came out, white kid from privilege, and he comes out one day, and I said, hey, how's it going? He's all happy. And he said, oh, Dr. Tom, you're not going to believe this. I'm like, what? He's like, I killed so many people in Call of Duty last night that I got a nuclear weapon as a prize, and I can't wait to use it when I get home from school. And I'm like stumbling backwards, like, what's happening right now, right? And so, of course, not thinking I was like, about his age, I was like, well, great, well, let me know when you play the game when people get prosthetic limbs. Let me know when that happens. When they get colostomy bags, let me know when that happens. And he's like, what? And his parents are like, Vin. I'm like, I get it, but like, this is what we're dealing with, right? And then lastly, I'll say that another big issue is the siloing of humanities and sciences. Why, at such a young age, are we telling students to pick a lane? You're going to either study art, history, philosophy, music, or you're going to study geology, physics, science, and these physical sciences, and never the two shall meet. Why, if the student is learning in physics class about nuclear weapons, should they not also be taking philosophy courses on ethics? Like, it makes no sense. And so that is also a huge issue in how we are handling the education. So I think that's a larger issue that we can do to really change, how and when they get introduced to this issue.
In the interest of time, I have 2 questions on deck, and I see a third if we get there we'll do that, but just so everybody knows, that's kind of where we're at in line of questions.
I just wanted to get your opinion on what's commonly known as the Samson option. Are either of you familiar with the Seymour Hersh novel from 1991?
No.
So
Familiar, but please.
apparently how it goes is that this journalist has determined that pretty much at least since the 70s, the most dangerous nuclear threat is Israel would say, we threaten to launch this against the Soviet Union if you don't do as we say, because that's going to trigger the chain reaction of all the mutually assured destruction. So I just want to see if you had any opinion about who might be like the world's largest nuclear threat at this point of actually triggering that kind of exchange.
I don't know about that kind of exchange, but I think just as it's been since before I was born, the United States and Russia are the threats. They're both threatening the use of nuclear weapons. And I think it's more likely that it would be used not covertly by somebody trying to do something like that. I think it'll be used by big, dumb militaries.
We obviously, Trump right now can end life on the planet in 20 minutes. Like, that's the biggest threat, obviously. But I'm also incredibly concerned about the rise of nuclear power technology, especially with Saudi Arabia right now.
Yes.
The Saudis will have the ability to create their own nuclear weapon. They will have the ability to sell that if they want that technology. They will be able to, it could possibly get stolen. These reactors could be victims of drone attacks. Like, the spread of nuclear power, the reactors, the technology, the uranium enrichment, plutonium, could be catastrophic. So that's another huge fear I have is what's this new deal with Saudi Arabia.
So I thank Bo and Vincent for two incredible presentations, and I'm always someone who tries to synthesize things in my mind. So two things stood out. In Bo, your closer about $2 trillion for other forms of safety. I'd love to see how that relates to your point about creative artists at the center of all movements. And as somebody who's an emerging poet, that really captured my heart, because it's something that everyone can do at the places where they're sitting day to day.
Yeah, I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is it must be nice to just be able to have $2 trillion for whatever you want to do and use that for just pure evil, because the biggest problem right now in our field is a lack of funding, and the arts are the last to get funding. It is awful. We struggle, PSR and all the organizations, we struggle so desperately to get our funding, and when three major funders at a national level came together and said they were going to put $10 million into this issue, of course we all got excited. And I went on the first call for that because I had all sorts of ideas, art projects, things like that. And the first thing they said was, if your proposal in any way deals with advocacy, we're not looking at it. Cool. So who got the money? Princeton, Harvard, MIT, Wisconsin, and Madison, who of course don't need it, and so that they can write an academic journal. It's going to be in an academic library that nobody's going to read, but it's a good line on your resume. And the artist still struggles. So that, to me, when you do that juxtaposition of $2 trillion for nuclear weapons to end the world, and artists just can't get a dime, when they can make such a difference because so many people are visual artists and independent filmmakers, and if we could fund artists to make a living as making video games to combat Call of Duty, like, there's so many ways we could do it, and they just can't get the money. So I think that's the obvious thing for me.
And I'll just share with you the understanding or thinking about a primary cause of these weapons as being money. The then further step that I have for abolishing nuclear weapons, which is really easy. We just give them the money. We say, here's all that money to not make them. You don't have to spend anything. Just take the money, you win. And they're going to get the money anyway, so let's give it to them, but don't make the weapons. So let's take control of our money and buy what we want, which is nothing, and just give them the money.
Of course, that doesn't count the racism and how much they want to just eliminate these people, but it's good there, right? Yeah, I forgot that part, but I mean, we're going to talk money too. One last thing is don't discount how powerful divestment can be. I mean, New York City got $450 million from nuclear weapons making producers divested from their pension fund, and that's big, that matters, and so I think there's a real power there in divestment.
Interject really quickly. Yeah. We're at time. I hope, I'm sorry for anyone who still has questions, but hopefully your, interest has been, this has sparked a lot of interesting dialogue that will continue. Obviously, it's like many lifetimes could be spent discussing all of these fascinating